Hey, 42 here. The wisdom of the crowd. The idea that the collective opinion of a large group of random people may be more accurate than the single opinion of an individual, even if that individual happens to be an expert in the field in question, is not a new concept. In fact, it's a really bloody old one. It was Aristotle who first discussed it in one of his most important works, a treatise on political philosophy, imaginatively titled Politics, that he wrote in 350 BC, using the rather bizarre analogy of something called a potluck dinner, where each guest at a dinner party brings one dish to a feast, representing their own particular speciality. The great Greek polymath said, "It is possible that the many, though not individually good men, yet when they come together, may be better, not individually, but collectively." It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but you get the general idea. To take a look at what is probably the most famous example of the wisdom of the crowd, we need to fast forward more than 2,000 years to, of all places, the 1906 County Fair in Plymouth, on the south coast of England. There was nothing overtly remarkable about this particular county fair, other than the fact that it just so happens to have been attended by one Sir Francis Galton, a Victorian-era gent with a superb pair of mutton chops, who was, it's fair to say, a pretty smart chap. Galton was, amongst other things, a statistician, a sociologist, a psychologist, an anthropologist, a eugenicist, little bit controversial that one, an explorer, a geographer, an inventor, a meteorologist, a protogeneticist, and a psychometrician. Just think about that the next time you're feeling all smug about being an accountant. Amongst his many accomplishments, Sir Francis Galton is known for having devised the very first weather map, which was featured in the Times newspaper in the UK. Though, oddly enough, his map featured the weather for the previous day, which feels about as useful as warning JFK to steer clear of grassy knolls whilst attending his funeral. Galton also attempted to quantify the power of prayer. Avid churchgoers amongst you might want to cover your ears here, because I'm afraid he found nothing. Though I must admit I don't think too much of his working in this case. Galton came to his conclusion based on the lack of a correlation between how long people lived and how often they prayed. However, he forgot to consider that mankind are a greedy bunch. Silly Galton, Mr. Big Buck CEO isn't praying for a healthy ticker, he's praying for a new yacht and for his hag wife to die so he can replace her with a slightly washed up supermodel. Oh, and Sir Francis also happens to be Charles Darwin's half cousin, by the way, because, you know, you can never have too many legs up in life. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. The highlight of the Plymouth Fair that year was a competition in which the lucky person to guess the correct weight of a rather less lucky ox would go home with its slaughtered carcass for their prize. Plymouth, apparently being a city of steak lovers, almost 800 people entered the competition. And though nobody guessed the correct weight of the ox, everybody did. Wait, what? How can both of these seemingly contradictory statements be true? Well, as we've heard from Sir Francis's impressive CV, when he wasn't busy trying to engineer the perfect humans by killing off all the simpletons, he liked to dabble in statistics, and whilst no individual pins the proverbial tail on the ox by guessing its weight exactly, when Galton took the average of all 800 guesses, he discovered, to his stoic Victorian amazement, that it was within an astonishing 1% of the correct weight, closer than any single guess had been, which when you think about it, is pretty remarkable. Do you know what else is remarkable? The enormous range of world-class courses available over at the Great Courses Plus. I honestly love the Great Courses Plus. I'm not lying when I say I use it every single week. They're incredible courses on every topic you can imagine, from history to physics to cooking, have inspired a huge number of my videos. Every one of their 11,000 plus top-notch courses is delivered by a leader in their field, from Ivy League professors to experts from National Geographic, the Smithsonian, and the Culinary Institute of America. Whether you want to learn history, maths, or science, or you just want to play chess well or become a better photographer, I can confidently tell you that there will be a course that will do exactly that for you. This video is about the wisdom of crowds, but in the fascinating course, Shocking Psychological Studies and the Lessons They Teach, Professor of Psychology Fad Polk teaches us how individuals often behave within those crowds. It's an intriguing insight into what the human mind is capable of, and why humans sometimes do terrible things. A must-watch, if you ask me. The Great Courses Plus is giving my viewers the great offer of a free trial. You can help to support my channel by checking it out via the link in the description. I'm sure many of you watching this video will have attended the odd fair in your time, and you'll no doubt have noticed how varied the clientele can be. For every knighted English polymath tearing it up on the dodgems, there's likely to be at least one mouth-breathing moron furiously fornicating on the spinning teacups. The Plymouth Fair was no different. Amongst the 800 guessers that day were more than a few individuals who would have been considered experts on oxen. Butchers, for example. But also plenty of others who didn't know their ox from their elbow. Bakers and candlestick makers, perhaps. And yet, the average guess of all 800 people, mouth-breathing fornicators and all, outperformed every single one of the experts. It certainly seems counterintuitive that a bunch of random people could somehow guess something as esoteric as the weight of an ox with more accuracy than butchers who cut the animals up for a living. And yet, that's exactly what happened in Plymouth that day. And the phenomenon has been replicated in studies of all kinds ever since. At least, under certain conditions, the intelligence of a crowd is unerringly accurate and far more reliable than the specialized knowledge of any individual within it. So, just what exactly is going on here? The idea is actually fairly simple. So long as certain parameters are met in the makeup of the crowd, the average opinion of a large number of people will tend to converge on the right answer to a given question, particularly when that question has a single correct answer. If we think about this in the context of our unfortunate ox, roughly as many people guessed its weight to be too high as guessed too low. And these bad guesses, the statistical noise, if you will, cancelled each other out, revealing the true answer. While Sir Galton and the soon-to-be slaughtered steer is the most famous example of the wisdom of the crowds in action, it isn't the only one. The USS Scorpion was a skipjack-class nuclear submarine that served in the United States Navy in the 1960s. But in 1968, the sub was lost at sea, with all 99 crewmen on board killed. There are many theories as to how the high-tech war machine was sunk. Some think a faulty torpedo may have launched itself and locked onto the only target nearby, the Scorpion itself. Others suspect it was a simple accident or malfunction, possibly of the battery. And still others, quite a few, judging by the number of books that have been written on the subject, think the submarine was sunk by the Russians, on whom the Scorpion had reportedly been spying. Just as unclear as the cause of the sinking was exactly where the tragedy took place. And it turns out, finding a 77-meter nuclear sub in more than 1 million square kilometers of Atlantic Ocean is about as easy as it sounds. That is, not very. But John Pena Craven, hell of a middle name you've got there, John, chief scientist of the Navy's Special Projects Division and the man tasked with locating the wreck, had an idea. He assembled a wide range of people, a crowd, if you will, made up of mathematicians, submarine specialists, salvage men, oceanographers, soldiers, and more, and asked them to guess where the sub was based on a series of possible scenarios as to how it might have been lost. To keep things interesting, Craven's crowd bet bottles of Scotch whiskey, Chivas Regal no less, on which of the scenarios they thought were the most likely. Once the hangovers had worn off, Craven analysed the results of his drinking game cum international search effort using some statistical jiggery-pokery that would have made Sir Francis Galton salivate. When the intellectual dust had settled, Craven had come up with a projected location for the wreck, some 400 miles off the Azores, based on the collective wisdom of all the people he had asked. And, as implausible as it may sound, when a Navy ship rocked up to search the area not long after, they found the wreck of the Scorpion, fewer than 200 meters away. Now, even to a skeptic, these are some pretty compelling examples, I'm sure you'll agree. But they do beg one rather obvious question. If crowds are this ridiculously intelligent, why don't we use them for everything? Screw AI, what about us? Well, to a certain extent, we actually kind of do use the wisdom of the crowds for everything. Especially if we're prepared to widen the definition just a little, in which case the general concept crops up all over the place. Websites like Wikipedia and Quora seek to aggregate the collective knowledge of humanity. Prediction markets are used to preempt all sorts of things, from the stock exchange to who's going to win big at the Oscars. Tech companies like Google use enterprise software designed to harness the wisdom of their own crowd, that is, their employees, to improve business decisions and make predictions about their own projects and performance. Oh, and I'd put good money on the fact that most of you watching this video wouldn't even consider watching a film with an IMDb score lower than 7. You aren't savages after all, although I think we can all make a special exception for Birdemic. The wisdom of crowds is also used, in a general sense at least, to elect the majority of the world's most powerful leaders, although admittedly that doesn't always go so well. And that's because there's a problem. Unlike the descendants of Dolly the sheep, not all crowds are created equal. And far from being wise, some crowds are in fact monumentally stupid. That's why we have stock market bubbles and, Hitler. But what makes a crowd wise? To answer that question, we can enlist the help of James Wackiest, the man who wrote the book on the subject. And I mean that literally. His book is called The Wisdom of Crowds. According to Wackiest, crowds are only wise if they fulfill certain key criteria. Wise crowds must be, amongst other things, diverse and independent. Let's take diversity first. And when we're talking about diversity here, we're talking specifically about diversity of opinions and knowledge rather than colour or creed. So why is diversity so important in a wise crowd? Because diversity brings different approaches, thought processes, and knowledge to the table. A homogeneous crowd, even one made up of experts, leads to narrowed thinking. We saw this in action when Sir Francis Galton found that the diverse crowd at the Plymouth Fair did a better job of predicting the weight of the ox than the individual experts amongst them. And this single example has been replicated in several studies since, including one carried out at the University of Michigan in 2004 that went so far as to show that decisions reached by a large, diverse group of problem solvers are actually more accurate than those made by smaller groups of the best individual problem solvers. Diverse groups are also less likely to be influenced by common external forces or authorities, and are less likely to share group allegiances that may sway their opinions. Independence is also a prerequisite for a wise crowd. Most of you will have no doubt seen the classic quiz show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Ask the Audience, one of the lifelines used by contestants, taps into the wisdom of crowds remarkably well. Since the show started, Ask the Audience answers have been correct around 91% of the time. That's versus 65% of the time for Phone a Friend, by the way. though admittedly phone a friend does tend to be saved for the harder rounds. But just imagine for a moment that during the voting for Ask the Audience, one member of the crowd stood up and shouted, "The answer is B!" Pretty much everyone who didn't already themselves know the answer would be influenced by the interruption and vote B. A similar thing might have happened at the Plymouth County Fair if someone had gone around tipping people off about the weight of the ox. Influence, in short, has the effect of skewing the results, completely undermining a crowd's wisdom. In a sense, if a crowd has been influenced in some way, it stops acting like a crowd at all and begins to act like an individual, with one person's opinion propagating like ripples on a pond until it's widely shared, regardless of its veracity. Influence is very likely a large part of the reason crowds make bad decisions in the real world when it comes to things like stock market bubbles. Members of the crowd aren't making independent decisions based on their own judgment of the situation. They're being heavily influenced by the views of others, herd mentality, and the popular pastime of the millennial, FOMO. When you stop and think about it, this requirement for wise crowds to be truly independent from one another is actually a bit of a worry. After all, juries, though they're made up of 12 diverse individuals, actually use influence as a central element in their decision-making process. And if you've ever seen the 1957 classic 12 Angry Men starring Henry Fonda, that's an 8.9 on IMDb, by the way, so you're safe. Then you'll know that just one person with a strong opinion might be enough to get you off the hook the next time you're on trial for murder. Or send your ass down for life, of course. Okay, so the wisdom of crowds is powerful. But wise crowds are hard to come by, particularly today when everyone is connected and therefore influenced 24 hours a day by social media, non-stop news, and mustache-wielding maniacs on YouTube. But don't worry, because like most cool things in life, tech giants are trying to harness the power of the wisdom of the crowds for their own foul ends through something called human swarming, modeled on the mass synchronization behaviors of fish, birds, and insects. Human swarming is touted as a kind of wisdom of crowds on steroids, using digital platforms and closed real-time feedback loops to allow groups of people to behave like a single, unified collective intelligence. It'll turn you and your mates into a hive mind, basically. Now, I'm sure your first instinct when faced with the prospect of becoming part of a hive mind, like me, would be to overthrow world governments and enslave humanity. But human swarming hasn't quite gotten that far just yet, more's the pity. It has, however, been used by groups of doctors to improve accurate pneumonia diagnoses in chest x-rays by more than 30%, and, even more intriguingly, to correctly predict the Kentucky Derby superfecta. That's the top 4 finishers at the Kentucky Derby, in order, at odds of 541 to 1. It isn't quite dominion over all mankind, but it's a start. Thanks for watching. Thanks to the Great Courses Plus for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check them out using the link below.